you want to just do Hey everybody. I say everybody. Hey, the one person watching the feed. That might even be my test person. But either way, we're going to get started a little late. Apologize for that. Had a little, getting ready for a feed, and you have the worst mistake, and that is one of these breaks. Is this, like, of all the things that could break, the most analog thing I have in the entire setup? Well, luckily I had it back up. So let's go ahead and switch over to some code. There's my pretty face in the corner, so you should enjoy that. And a couple things to recap. I haven't really made any real changes. There was one change I had to make to the package JSON, and I just deleted all my. Hey Lindbergh, I think that's how you're pronouncing your name. Thanks for joining the stream. I had to re-update this to make sure I had the latest version of this. There's a plugin in Visual Studio Code that I'm using that was complaining because it wants to make sure it has the latest version, and evidently I didn't. And so that's why you'll see that there's a couple of things modified here. Otherwise, straight from the repository. And the other change you'll be noticing is that I have I switched from Viter to a different extension for Vue, and it is called, I can never remember the name of it, Volar. Oh, it says reload required. Let's reload. I must have updated last night. And it should give us a little less. There it's complaining again. I'm just going to ignore it this time. Should give us less bad warnings. Viter was giving us bad warnings before. But the real reason I moved was this magic button. If you've never seen it, is it splits the template and the code into two windows viewing the same file. All it's really done here, if you haven't used this before, is collapses the template on this one, collapses the script on this one, just so we can edit them side by side, which I'm really enjoying. Because we're kind of zoomed in, let me go ahead and make it a little wider because we're not going to need that sidebar very often. And let's go ahead and make sure we execute this. Where's my scripts? Run the dev build. And so we should have our app working like it did before if I put the right address in. I'm going to adjust that a little. Come on. Oh, there we go. I don't know why the startup time was a little slow, but once it gets going, it's usually pretty good. And if you remember from last time, we're able to add things to the shelf. Can't add it a second time, and we should be good. So let's continue from there. One of the things I'm going to want to do is look at adding items to our bookcase and then looking at the actual bookcase items. And so that's really going to require, let's open up a new terminal here. It's really going to require that we go ahead and install at Vue routing. I think that's what its name is. Let's find out together. Nope. So let's go back to the browser. And I'm just going to go to Vue, somewhat so you can see that this is the way I always remember to do it. But with Vue CLI, we could have added it and it would have done a lot of the work for us. But We're not using the CLI in this case, so it's not going to let us, or certainly instruct us how to do it. Where's the package? Make sure we're using. Oh yeah, we'll make sure we're using the latest version. And of course, it's just Vue router. And we're more specifically getting Vue routing 4 because we're using Vue 3. It's added it. We can see it here in our. I don't need to do that. You can see it here in our package.json that we now have Vue router here, and it's the version 4 that goes well with our Vue 3 and our Vue X4. So let's go ahead and create a new file. And in this case, I'm going to create a new file in router index.ts. Are we using JS or TS in this project? I suddenly forgot. Well, let's do TS. Oh, there it is, TypeScript, yeah. And I'm just going to put router, just so I know what the file is at all times. And I'm going to export a default object, though I'm going to need to actually bring that in. And if you remember, or you've done this before, then we're going to just say router. Let's go ahead and bring in that import. Does it create? No. Let's build. We're really going to have to go back to the docs for this. Come on, Sean. You should remember better than that. As we're getting started. And here we're going to pass in the routes. Now, what are the routes? Why doesn't like router there? I'm in the wrong. No, that's V4. Make sure I know what I'm talking about. So there's our routes. Is it really Vue router? I didn't think so. That's very strange. This looks like it's been changed. Make sure we're using the latest. Yeah, it says we are. API reference. Composition API. Use router. Should not be this difficult. Current route. That is so weird. Hope this is as weird as everybody else thinks it is. Yeah, those are all the routes. very confusing. But let's go ahead and create our routes for now. And routes is just going to be an array. And this array is going to, oh, I know why. It's because it's this whole return default. Let's do const router equals, nope, that wasn't the problem. But we'll come back to that. I really need to be clear about this. Okay, so the path is going to be for our root page, and then I want to specify a component, and I'm going to make this our library component, our book, say shelf instead. You'll love when you're throttling a little. Path. And this will be our existing one that we're already using, which is, let's call this our, just say add, for us to add. And we probably will need to remove things at some point. And we've been calling that just bookcase, right? It's basically this template. And so we'll call this our bookcase. Actually, let's call this our bookcase. And let's call this our library. Now, of course, we don't have these yet. We're going to need to build these in order for this to work. Doesn't like that either. That's where I was. I should not. Letting it add the default object is always my problem. And so we need to find these, and these routes want a different format. No, that's right. Path component, path component. Oh yeah, we need to say options here. We go back here, we can actually see this, and the create router takes an array, takes an object instead with just history, and assuming we're using web hash history for now. So they changed this API recently. Routes equals, well, actually I can just say routes and history router dot create web hash history, and we may later change this to be just slash, but because we're going to be integrating with ASP.NET, this is going to work a little better. Hope I'm not mumbling again. If any of the two people watching would tell me if I'm mumbling, that would be great. So we're going to need to import these, and because we started with a directory structure here of views, we have this bookcase view and we have the library view. I'm going to actually just rename these, because we can rename these pretty easily, because these don't really define a name at all. It's just exporting the entire object into our project. So I'm going to go ahead and call this our library. And then we can more easily just import from views library dot view. So that one's fine, but we also need to do the same thing for bookcase. And this will be a new view that we haven't generated yet. So now our router is fine, but let's go ahead and just create, whoops, a views bookcase.view. And all we'll do here is just have a template that says bookcase coming soon, right? So I don't need a script yet because all I'm doing is having both of these views exist. So they're being imported into our, let me make this a little smaller, into our router. And now we need to go ahead and open up our main, because here, instead of importing the router object from Vue, we're going to actually import the router from router. Whoops, it's just one period. And then here we'll say use router. And so we're getting our own route object that we're exporting. Remember, we're exporting it here as a default object. And then we're injecting it as another piece into the chain of when we create the app, so that we can use the router through our whole object. And so this means that we need to make a couple of changes to the way that app view loads, because right now we're loading the bookcase specifically, and we don't want to actually do that. Let's leave the is busy and is error there, and let's get rid of this bookcase. But what we're really going to do is say router output. I think it's router output. Questioning myself. You should wake up later than you think you should. Router view, of course it is. And so this will be injected into the same place. And what's interesting here that I want you to be aware of is that we're still using that same store here. So we can have things outside of the router that are generic to the individual views. So we can actually use the error and busy across all of our different views in this case. May not be exactly what we want, but it'll be a good starting point. So let's get rid of our components here for bookcase, because obviously that's not there. And our components are going to be injected again through that route. Right? When it notices that a slash in our project, or the root of the object, then it's going to say bookcase. Though I think we may need to get rid of the slashes. But let's see what it says over in our other terminal. No, it seems to like it. So let's switch. Whoops. Where'd our Firefox go? There we go. Let's go ahead and refresh it again. And it's weird that it's not coming up. Was fine. The dependency is reloading. But why is it not serving it? Import not found default. It's in the router. Library and bookcase. Unless the view router is wrong. Very strange. Usually would show us an error here as well. Let me try something. That's not actually a bad idea. Here's my coffee. Thank you, Raventhorn. That was an excellent suggestion. Except for all the coffee I got on my desk. Still doesn't like our import not found default. Let's see which it doesn't like. Obviously this is going to break everything, but I want to just see if... Yeah, it doesn't like that router. That's interesting. I wonder if I just have the wrong version of the router. Vue router 4. No, that should be fine. Vue router. That is so strange that it doesn't like this Vue router. So I just hit F12 in case that wasn't super apparent. And I'm looking at the TS file, which is effectively the TypeScript version of it. And I just want to see what is being exported here. Export interface. So it doesn't look like... Of course, router is not going to find anything. See if we can do it by case sensitivity. So what I'm looking for is the actual... Oh, you know what? I know exactly what's wrong. Duh. The new format is going to make me crazy. So we're, instead of getting the default, we actually have to bring in each of the pieces we need. So we don't have to use, but let's add that there. And if we go back here, it's all great, right? Because we have our, it says bookcase coming soon from our default. And if we just say new, it's going to make it this indecipherable in the console for some reason. Let's break this out. I must have not called it new. Router. Of course I didn't. I said add. Just so we know that we're getting the same one. Still working, still in the same container. We don't have links over to these yet. So let's go ahead and add those. Let's go back to our app.vue, and this is going to become sort of the container for it all. So I'm going to create a header here. My bookcase. And let's go ahead and do an unordered list. List item, href, to that. Actually, let's bring in, of course, this shouldn't be this should be router link. And this should be to. And here we can go ahead and just say home. Even if we have the extra piece right there. You'd think I forgot how to write any of this. Let's say add to library. And let's use some styling here. Let's just make these both buttons. We could make them prettier later, but for now that should be good enough. So we have them, and of course we have never defined a class button. So let's do that real quick. I'm thinking I should skip a bunch of stuff, but we're here to see it all work. So if we go to our assets, let's go ahead and create a dot button. And that's just where we're going to apply some things. And let's say background, say blue, make it kind of a light. No, let's make it a dark blue with some white text and rounded. And let's see what this looks like now. So they're overlapping, which is not great, but we'll get to that part in a minute. We also want to say no underline. And it does not like them. Let's be more specific. Wonder if that'll fix it. Yep. So in this case, we're still using those routers because they're going to be rendered as anchor tags. And we should be able to go between these pretty quickly now. Not the most brilliant design, but we also want to change this to, where's our UL? So we're going to want this to be let's say flex and no list none, and let's go back to our button. Just say margin X equals 2, just to give us a little space there. Does not like that. We actually need to add them here because they need to be in the list items need to be spaced. Woohoo! 2 is probably too much. And then here I'm just going to add the last, which is ML0, and that's to not push those in. Going to change these to ML and MR. Come on, Sean, you can type an MR. Okay, it's not great yet, but let's go ahead and get rid of the header here since we have them in each page, and just leave them up here for us to do. And we need to probably get rid of this little spacing here and some other things, but for now I'm just going to leave it because now we at least have a working route. Now, a couple things we need to fix here first. We want to implement the bookcase, but I just want to make sure that this bookcase here isn't reloading every time, because what's happening, because we really depended, let's say, on a shelf size of 3, and we go back home and we come back, our shelf size is still 3, and this still works, but it's reloading. We can see that loading happening. Hey, surly dev. I hope you're not going to be surly with me. Is we don't want this reloading to happen every time. So let's go over to our bookcase. Oops, not a bookcase. Let's go over to our views and let's go to the library view. And if you remember, let's go ahead and open this up. Is that we have this mounted that's going to load by calling load book list every time. And so what we really want to do is tell this book list only load if you need to load, right? Only load if you don't already have it in memory. So let's look at the index for the store, and our action here for load book list should do a couple things. It should say if here, we're going to need to add state to the list of our objects that were being passed in, because we need to check. So if state book list dot length, actually we can just say if state not book list, so we don't already have a collection there, then go ahead and load it. So in this case, we're only going to load it if we don't have a book list. Otherwise, of course, that's not going to work because that's the category. We're going to need to add some state here, aren't we? Because we want to be able to reload this every time the category changes. So let's just add set current category. And I'm adding a mutation here so I can go ahead and add it. And this will just be state.category equals category. And we'll add category to our list. And so instead of saying if it's been loaded, because this would actually, make it all break, is we're going to say state.category does not equal category. So we're essentially just making sure that the category is changed. It's going to start as empty, and so this should work on the first time. If I've done this right, which is no guarantee, when I go home and come back, it's still saying loading. Wonder why that is. Let's find out. So let's look at those dev tools. If we go over to the view, this is one of the more interesting things. Is let's refresh this page for a minute. And here we can actually look at the app state. The inspector timeline. There's what I'm looking for. And so we've got mutations happening. We can see that it set these different mutations. But what happens when we go home? No mutations happened. And then let's go back to the add library. And we can see clear busy, set busy. Why was... That's very strange. It's never setting the category. This is why we're still getting that same behavior. Why didn't it reload our... Oh, because we're never ever setting it. Commit set current category. It would help if we actually set the thing we're depending on it. And are we calling it? No, let's call it current category. Make sure we're getting it down here. Boom, boom, boom. Hope this makes sense to everybody. Now let's try this. I'm going to close that for a minute. Let's go home, back, still says it's loading. Should not say loading. So let's look at those dev things again. Oh, mutation might set current category. Well, that might be the problem. What do I call it? Set current category. Oh, I misspelled it. Oh, you guys are supposed to catch these things. I'm very disappointed in each and every one of you. Not really, but I'm considering this the only pair programming with as many people as show up, so I expect more of you, I really do. So if we go home and back, we'll see that after the first load, it should continue. And let's make this science this time, which of course we're getting a load because we're changing it. And then if we go home and come back, why is it setting it back to science fiction? Oh, it's the same problem. In that, in our bookcase, nope, in our library, we are setting up the categories, ref, and we're setting every time we come back the ref to the last one. So now that we have the state saved, right, we can go ahead and say const category equals computed store.state.current category. And we'll set this to its initial state, whatever that current category happens to be. Yeah, because we're only going to get that the first time. And then back in the view itself, the other thing we'll want to do is set the default value here to science fiction. That way we get the science fiction store to begin with. Line, now I'm going to have to look at these. Line 34. Did I misspell it again? Thank you. You make my life so much easier. And so when we create this here, we'll see C in categories, ID, value, ID. Oh, I shouldn't need to do that. And oh, I already had a computed a current category, which we shouldn't need anymore. I think it feels like we're making it more complicated than it needs to be. Let's get rid of this computed because we don't actually need the computed. We just want to get the latest value because when we call load, load is going to go ahead and get that. So let's come in here and unmount it. Oh, we're not even using it. Wow. Go ahead and stay store dot state dot current category. Nope. I'm going to want this to actually say current category dot value. Starting to make sense. I hope it is to you too. And so here we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to say we've got our current category as the model, and we're just going to call load. I'm going to change this API to just say load. And here we'll pass in the current category. So the load will always get the current category, and as it gets changed here, but this way we're not needing to get at what that value is. We're going to change the current category because it's the model. Load happens, and this will cause it all to work. So let's says science fiction, but it didn't load science fiction. That works, and science fiction works. Why doesn't it work with the first? Why doesn't it work the first time? Let's find that out. Science. I spelled it right, correct? Do a little copy and paste just to make sure I actually called it down. We can move a number of these pieces in. It's picking the right one, but it's not loading. Why is it not loading? Let's find out. Let's start to use the debugger here. Because we're using Vite, by the way, if you've noticed, I've changed to using the correct pronunciation, Vite, since it's French, I guess, or Italian. Now I don't remember. So let's go over to our library. And when we call load, set a breakpoint there, just so whether we can actually get the current value. Comes here, says it's science fiction. It says load book list. Let's get rid of that. Let's go to our view, or our store, I should say. And let's continue running it, or rerun it as I did. And the category we're bringing in is science fiction. Oh, it's not loading it because it thinks it's the same already. Makes sense. So what happened here was inside here, because I was using the default from our view, then this is loading this. This is avoiding loading it the first time until we actually see a change. So I'm going to add an and here to say state.booklist, or I should say, or not book list. So if the category isn't changed or the book list is empty, we should load it that first time. I could have gotten around this by doing a couple of other things, but I'm going to make this as the decision of what we're going to do that first time. Let's go ahead and run this through. Still does not like it. Why is that? So get here in the category, or if the state book list, the target is blank. Make this a little bigger so we can use it more logically. I just want to make sure that this value is false. So let's go and watch state.booklist. Not, okay, I'm gonna have to be, because it's a proxy, I believe the problem is, and let's find out real quick, is that I need to say length equals 0. Still does not like it. That is so weird. Must be something super common I'm doing. Of course, it's not if not list equals 0, it's if it does equal 0. So we refresh the page. There's our lovely breakpoint. Let's go ahead and hit F8 now that we can skip it. And it's loading that first time. Loading every other time. Okay, we're all good. And as we add things to our shelf, we can see the shelf size is adding. We can add other ones. And so now we have 5 books. And so let's go ahead and start implementing this home page. Let's get rid of some of these so we don't need them just for the moment. And let's go to our bookcase view. So our bookcase view, let's go ahead and start with the script, type equals TS. And I don't know whether I've talked to you about this before. I recently did a video on the setup script that is now official in Vue 3.2 Still not a big fan of how magical it is, so I'm going to continue using yield version of export default create component setup. Now, why doesn't it like that? Lang. It's always the little stuff. No, I want prettier to be the formatter. Thank you. And doesn't like create component. God, this is embarrassing to see how bad my memory has gotten these days. Define. Whew. I can get rid of that. And so let's go ahead and get started with the more interesting part, which is const my books. And we'll say that's a ref of store. Well, that's annoying. Missing declaration import from store. There we go. State dot my books, which we don't have yet. And then we'll just return my books. What do we call it in the store? There's the book list, and there's my shelf. That's what we called it. Shelf. And I'm going to go ahead and call it shelf in both places. Let's bring in ref. Now we can go ahead and I'm going to start by just creating a little v4 work or book in shelf. And it wants a key so it can more efficiently get b.key. And let's just say b.title. Just so we can see if this is actually working. And of course, it's complaining again. Console. Oh, because we don't have anything there, of course, it's not going to show anything. Let's go home now. We can see we're getting those items that we've added to the library, even if they're completely different. Yep. So we have the basics of this working. Of course, it's really ugly. So let's come back here. And let's go ahead and say my bookshelf, just so we know that it's there. And we can use some of the stuff from the library just to be able to see what we're doing here. And because we want to be able to show this as an object, let's go ahead and copy it and let's create our first reusable component. So let's call this components, and I'll call this our book.view. And the idea here really is to allow us to have a component that we're going to be using in both places, so that as we make them better, it'll all work. Export default define component. Bring that down to its own line. And here I'm going to say name is going to be book. And then we can go ahead and do our setup. Const book. Nope. Don't even need a setup in this case. We can just say props book type equals string, required equals true. So we're just going to take this book as a property in because we're not really going to allow them to edit it at all. And actually, I think we can say work here. Let's see if we have to bring that in. Whoops. Models. Books. Interesting. I'm going to say object for now. Let's see if we can make that type safe a little later. But for now, let's go back to our library and let's replace this with book. Equals book. Of course, we're going to need to add the component here. Components equals book. Let's see if we can bring that in automatically. Of course, it doesn't want to. Import book from components book.view. I like to keep these capitalized so that I know that they're ours. And I'll need to go ahead and bind this. If I remember correctly, yeah, to make it go and bind this to an actual object. So we have it as a component, we're still using it. Let's go ahead and use the same one over here in our bookcase, so I should rename it to bookshelf. And here, let's go ahead and put this. Let's go ahead and add book here. Book and bookshelf, right? And if we've done this right, once we add a couple of things to our shelf and we go back home, we should see it fails undeniably. That's because, of course, we didn't add the component here. Or bring it in. Import. So now when we refresh it, it's not showing any because we're not yet saving any of the data there. But let's see if this actually works. Nope. Let's find out what it doesn't like. Component. Book failed to resolve. Component book. What doesn't it like about that? There's our book and there's our book. There's the components we're getting from bookcase. But it works in library. Book and shelf. We gotta check the line to see if any of you figured out the obvious mistake here. Failed to resolve component book. Am I loading it from the wrong directory? Let's try this just to make sure we have the right one. Components, book.view. So it's certainly pulling it in right. like that. vnode unmounted, router view, bookcase. Why doesn't it like it? See, it was showing this a second ago, and then here it won't necessarily show it. Is it because I didn't say the right thing? Glad I found that S. Woohoo! And of course, this is just going to list them like this because we don't have them in a shell. So let's, I'm going to go ahead and borrow this as well. And just wrap these. Could probably also just get rid of this and put this on here. Let's go ahead and do that. Make it even cleaner. No, it needs to be a child of flex. I forgot. Yeah, we're gonna need that piece. Oh, I know. I think we can also do this on here. And I broke something horribly. Ooh, that's a lot better. Clearly not. Let's go back to our needing the container. Because we're actually going to want to add remove book down here. So let's go ahead and do that. And if we look at the way we did the button here, remove book. And we don't need the disabled because once the book's gone, it should be gone. And remove from shelf. And here, of course, we're going to need a remove. And from our store, we're going to need a new method here. So we have an add to bookshelf here. We're going to need the reverse of this, which is remove from shelf. Now there's a lot of boilerplate we're adding here, but I'm kind of okay with that. I'd rather have some of the safety I'm getting from here, but when you write your own, wouldn't it be a big surprise if you went ahead and did this in a simpler manner, not using Vuex. I'm kind of overcomplicating this simple example in order to show some different techniques, but not necessarily what you would want in your own. So if we can find the book key, then we're going to want to say shelf.splice, and we're going to start that. Actually, let's change this to find the index of it, so we can splice it nice and fine. If index is greater than -1, then we're going to splice from index, and we're going to delete 1. Let's see if I did that right. path to the library, and then back to the bookcase. Hate that we're mixing all sorts of metaphors, so I'm going to make a couple of quick changes. I'm going to change this from bookcase to shelf, just so we have it as the name shelf everywhere. And let's see what that did to our router. Change the path, which means we don't need to change it here, but to be a good citizen, I'm going to make sure it doesn't say that anywhere. So we have the remove, and then we can say state dot store dot dispatch remove from shelf, pass in our lovely book that we got passed in, and then we can just come down here and say remove. It's part of our UI. I think we need to bring in work as well. Better. So there's my empty bookshelf. Let's go ahead and add a couple of books. There's our couple of books again. Not all that well designed yet. We can go ahead and fix that later. But when we say remove from shelf, nothing happens. And let's look at Vue just to see if it actually tried to call it. Oh, unknown action, remove from shelf. Store. From shelf. Remove from shelf, okay. I just named it weirdly. Remove book from shelf. Yeah, I'm going to keep it named that to be matching what our other action was, and then just make sure I change that to the right name. We'll get to saving this really soon. Once we have this, if we go back to add to the library, you'll notice that it's has removed Brave New World here. So let's go ahead and remove Brave New World here, and then it's allowed again over here. And so we can kind of get where we want to with a lot of this. To make a couple of to make one change, which is to use that class over here in shelf. And luckily we did the class globally, so we can go ahead and use it here. Otherwise we would actually need to change it. Notice I didn't have to refresh, and now we're getting that lovely piece of that. And let's make one more change, because let's add our button class there, just so it's a little prettier. Let's go ahead and do the same here. Now it's no prettier, and that's because our CSS was just applying it to a button. So let's do button, and then a dot button. Don't worry, I would not repeat this stuff. The underline isn't required for buttons, but will be for things that are anchor buttons. And now we have a much prettier button that looks like all the other buttons. Whee! Again, these are still a little ugly. I'd want to, make sure this was down here and all the sizes were fine, but it's a good place to go ahead and do a checkpoint here. I'm just going to say routing added. Oh, I've got to change this master. Bugging me that it's not main, but we'll get to that. in a later episode. I'm not going to worry about it right now. Get rid of that node module so we can see everything we're doing. Now let's talk about storing it. And there's really kind of two pieces to storing the state. One is we could be storing it directly in the browser, and eventually we're going to want to store it when we're not in the browser as well, when we're saving it to a server. And so we could go down the pretty short rabbit hole of going to our store and starting to save this state into local storage, which is something a lot of organizations do. But for us, let's start thinking about building an API next. See how we're doing. Yeah, we have time to get started with that. And so I'm going to, if you remember in our project, I'm going to open this in just File Explorer. As we have our Wielder stream here with a source folder, and this bookcase is really the client. And so I'm going to borrow this path, and let's start up. And I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2022 because I want to use .NET 6 for all of this stuff. And for us, there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could bring the Vue project into a new ASP.NET project, but let's start simple and let's just create an API. So I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to use the ASP.NET that's with Razor pages, WebAssembly. Where's the empty one? There we go. Because I'm just creating a very minimal API, I'm not going to bother with controllers and views. We're going to use the minimal APIs for now, and I'll call this our bookcase.api. I'm going to leave off HTTP for now, but I do want .NET 6 preview, because that's where all the minimal API stuff is. Did it really just crash? No. Let's bring this over to where the other ones are. Oop. And this one, just to make sure you can see the whole thing. There we go. This is always a very interesting, like, making sure everything fits on the screen that you guys can see. And so all we really get here is a simple app settings file. Pretty standard if you've done ASP.NET before or .NET Core. And then we just get a program.cs. And this is the new sort of very plain way of doing this. So we're just going to create a new builder object. We're going to tell it that we want to add the developer acceptance page, and then we're just going to do some map gets here. Or we're just going to map some individual APIs and then call them. And so in our case, I'm going to do a map trying to think of how I want to do this. I want to get we're going to need to add authentication at some point, but we're going to leave that down the road. We're going to assume that my user is the one and only user in the system for now. And let's go ahead and say get shelf, right? And here, just in a Lambda, I'm going to want to go ahead and get at that data. So what is that data going to look like? It's actually, let's go ahead and create a data folder and a models folder. And then I'll just call this, calling them works. And this will just be the same shape that we're storing on the client. So we look at the client, and we have those models here, right? We have the work model and the response model, but do we want to store this whole model in here so we can get it? What we'd really like to do is actually just store the keys, and that way we could use those keys to go ahead and load those models for us. And so with this idea of our simplest version is we're just going to have it let's do this. Let's start super simple. And instead of doing any of this data access yet, so I'm going to hard code. I don't know why it keeps on moving it to the back. I'm just going to hard code some keys here. So if we look at Vue for a minute, and that's our timeline inspector. I'm going to look at our library. And this book object has a key. I'm just going to return a couple of these keys. That did not work. Copy. Copy. I don't know why it hates me right now. There we go. And let's pull another one of the books. Because one of the things that we have to be a little concerned with is that the book may not be in the current list of categorized objects yet. So, new string array. I think this will do the inference. Let's see. Going from JavaScript / TypeScript back over can get a little confusing. So let's see if we can just call this API real quick. Let's go ahead and run it. Localhost 5000, shelf. Woohoo! We're getting the data back in the raw version we're going to need, which is just an array of these keys. And we're going to want to turn that into whatever is here in the home bookshelf, right? And so let's do a couple of things. Let's not show any of that or that. Is we're first going to want to be able to call it from our bookshelf. So let's go back to there. And we're, so the shelf here, we're starting with an empty array. And let's go to our app.main. And let's do it on its setup. And the reason I want to do it on its setup is I want to make sure that whatever URL we're going to, whatever routing aspect, that we can go ahead and have this happen. So on mounted of this first object, we're going to want to call some code. And in this case, it's going to be store.dispatch load shelf. And so all we're doing here is really, let's make sure to add it on mounted, is when this first app loads, it's going to try to dispatch an action on our object here called async load shelf. And this is probably going to be a multi-step affair. The reason is that we need to not only get it from the API, but also convert it into those book objects. And so let's see how we can do that. Let me put a comma there. Now, if you remember down here, when we go ahead and load that bookshelf, we're actually calling load books by category. Where are we getting that? Load books by category. Oh yeah, that's from our book API. So here we have the books API where we're getting it from the open library, and we'll probably be adding to that. Let's go ahead and export an async here as well to load shelf. And this doesn't have any parameters again. We're going to use that same Axios situation here. We're going to say, let's go ahead and set up the URL. And what is that URL? For now, it's going to be HTTP localhost 5000 shelf. I know some of you are already yelling at the screen about something that we'll get to in just a second. Relax, really. This is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to get the result as an await Axios get, and I'm going to type this as a string array. Will that work? Yeah, good. And get it from the URL. Now eventually we'll have to add some other things here, but this will be good enough. If result.status equals 2000, 200, then return result.data, which will be that array. And we can tell that because we can actually see that because we've typed this as a string, as an array of strings, that we're getting that result. Otherwise, we'll return as undefined. So we can do something about it. So up here, we can do the same things we were doing before, which was clear the busy and clear the error, just so we have it. And I'll do a little copy and paste. So we're going to get this by load shelf. Make sure we're bringing that in. Yeah. Usually it does it for you. And if the results exist, then we're going to need to do something else. So if the results worked, else we're going to go ahead and commit failed to load the shelf. Exception while loading the shelf. Right? The thing we need to do here is take this results and turn them into actual calls to Open Library. So if we look at our browser here, I know. Open Library, and I'm going to just go into the API documentation. And when we call something like books, like we've been doing, and we use this Open Library, right, of looking at an individual. Whoops, that wasn't the API call. Come on. There's the book API. So if I have this right, whoops, that is not at all what I wanted. Is we're going to want to call. Come on, Sean. Let's go back to here so I can just borrow this. As I think the key that we're using is actually also the API key. And let's see if that just works. Nope. So there's the works. Oh, that's right. I was so close. If this doesn't work, we'll have to get rid of the API piece. Yeah. Ta-da! Now the question is this the same format as the other? Because it really doesn't look like it. Looks like we can get some of the same information, but it's certainly not the same object. But does that matter? Like, how we're storing these these be a lot different than how we're getting them in the other version. Because I'm curious if book is also in the ISBN format. Oh, there's the format. Let's see what response format we can get that we're going to want. Vue API. I have a few different ones of these. Data. Let me try that. This looks like the same one we were looking at. So does that. So it doesn't look like it's actually using those. Well, let's fix the other problem first. So we actually see that it's throwing an exception here. And that's because we're getting cross-origin request blocked. Woo! We want to be able to allow this if we're not hosting them together. So for now, since we haven't really integrated them into one project, let's go ahead and do one of two things. We could bring it into the project and just allow for everything to be served, which we're not going to do. Instead, I'm going to say app.use cores as a piece of middleware, but I also need to configure the cores. Let me just make sure that we can't do it all in one with this new format. I haven't used new cores with minimal APIs yet. Policy name, CFG. Here we can configure, yeah, this is what we're going to do. Allow any origin. And you're not going to want this. In fact, let's do this just to be safe. I'm going to add this allow any origin. Only in development, so that we're going to be clued in that we have to either fix it or integrate it later. Any method, allow any header. Does a neat little trick where it wants to get that. You can see the loading happening here. Let's see what it doesn't like, if not anything. There's our console. Well, that's certainly not the reason. So did the get, got the response, no response. Why did it close on us? Or when we did the edit, it just stopped the server. Let's try this again. Oh, because we don't have a service for cores. Yeah. Yeah. I get you. So builder. Dot services dot add cores. And so the way the minimal API stuff works, if you haven't looked at it before, is that before it's built, we have to actually add any services we need. Add any services. And then everything after build is essentially the callback. And one of the interesting things here is that cores requires you add cores, but we could also use singletons. Closures. So anything we create here, we could also use in the map gets if we didn't want to necessarily worry about dependency injection in some very small cases. But we'll battle that in a minute. So let's go back to here. Let's go ahead and run it. Got the values, but of course we're not doing anything with it, but we were able to get the values, and the response is that array just like we wanted to. Now we need to do something with these to turn them into objects that we can actually show. And this is where things can get a little weirder because we're dealing with a third-party API. So let's go back to that problem. I don't know why this got minimized like that. Let's go back here, and if we get the value, we're getting the title, the type, and then a bunch of covers. So let's see. There's the details, which is yet another version. Key authors, books, identifiers. And those are the URLs in the cover. So let's try this version. Nope, this is not accepting any of those. Okay. By work ID works. So this is this request format. I see. So if we go ahead and get this, let's try this. I don't think that's going to work, but that's okay. Because we needed to say bib keys. Bib keys equals OLID, which is Open Library ID, colon. Let's get rid of the JSON. as a callback. Oh, maybe I have to say format. I think that's the piece I need. Format. Yeah. And that worked so poorly. Okay, that's because I couldn't find it. Okay. Is it OLID or not? Library. Bib keys, OLID, weird. Ran on this before where that ID is interesting. OLID should certainly work there. Why doesn't it work? And it is a colon, right? Yep. And none of you have found it. None of you have found it, so I'm very disappointed in all of you. I feel like I'm making this way harder than it needs to be. So let's go back to our original assumption, which was just this format. Because really even though we're getting our data in that works format, we're really only wanting a couple of properties, which we could set up as an interface as well. So let's try this for now, at least so we can move on with some of the code. Because what we want to be able to do here is for each, yeah, of course that's not going to work. Less than results dot length. So we're going to go through each of the results and try to pull up the actual type. Now this is probably going to mean we're going to need to do the same thing for each one of the individual ones, of course. And of course I didn't think this out before we started it, but let's just start. Let's just make this work in the way we want it to. So let's go ahead and create a new const work result equals await load work with result. Oops. Results x. If work result, then we can go ahead and commit add to shelf and pass in the work result. May not like that, but at least this will give us a place to start. So let's go back to our API. How are we doing on time? We're running out a little. This is where we can go ahead and borrow our URL here. I'm going to use the backslash just so I can inject in here. Work ID string. Go ahead and get it, but this time we're going to be getting hopefully a work. It's probably where this is going to fail. Let me go ahead and bring in models from books. And if it works, we're going to go ahead and return the work. still don't understand why TypeScript doesn't make these equivalent, but it doesn't. So let's see if any of this worked. My guess is we're going to need to. Nope, that is not. That's why that got like that. Oh, why is that? Oh, this is saying it's being blocked, but it's actually that this URL is not found. So one of the things they do is they just disallow it if it's a bad URL, because I have formatted it incorrectly. It is actually our bookshelf here is we're not going to include, oh, it does include works is the whole name. So I'm just going to include that. Let's see if that works better this time. Still getting the double slash for some reason. I think what I want to do is actually just store the OL IDs, the Open Library IDs. That way I'm not going to run into this problem of how do you format. And so there we're getting them. It says there's no error. Did that actually work? It did and it didn't. So our compile time check worked because we told it was going to be a work, but of course the data that's in it didn't work because these are two different sorts of objects. This says these two are in our bookshelf, but when we look at the library, it doesn't recognize them as the same object because we're not really actually dealing with them as the same object. So let's do a couple of things before we wrap up. Let's look at our store, and when we, I think it's in the store we're doing this. There we're checking for the book key and the book key, so that should be okay. But when we're in our library, when we're testing it, how are we testing it? Book on shelf, key, find book key. That is interesting, because that should locate the key unless they're actually different. So this should show that this is already on the shelf. Figure out why. I'm going to go back to Vue because I just want to look at the state of the library. So if we look at this book, oh, because they're comparing the key against that whole key. Cover edition key. But so when we load it, let's go back to home. This shelf has books, and its key should be the same, yeah. Key, even though it is a different kind of object, even though we're trying to tell it. This is one of the interesting things about TypeScript, that if you've done work in type-safe languages like JavaScript and TypeScript, you might go, why did this work? Because remember that type safety is only working at the runtime, and because we told at compile time, because we told the get that we were getting a work, it's going to treat it as a work. Though at runtime, this is still just JavaScript. There's no type checking in here. But so key against key should still work. That is weird. So we look at the library now. We look at this first book. Key works OL. I think I know why. because they're not the same object. So let's refresh this and see what happens. We go home through there and it still doesn't like it. So that's not the problem. Book on shelf. Disabled if the book we're dealing with is in the shelf. Interesting. Let's see if we can figure out why. So if we look at our views and our library, let's stop there. Then our book dot key. Oh, book dot key. Why is that undefined? Oh, because we actually haven't run it yet. Yeah, because what we really want this is there. So our key and our key works, OL. That should return true. But what does it actually return? I'm going to break these on 2 lines so I can see. Refresh it. So key equals key. Refresh it again. Oh. I should include Brave New World, but I still don't like that. I don't like that it's finding the whole object. So let's find index that's greater than -1. So that should be true. Why won't it let me just... Okay, so it's doing what it's supposed to do. I wonder. Yeah. Don't you hate when you chase completely the wrong bug? So the bug we're running into actually is in the CSS. Because we don't have a way of saying button disabled. It's disabling it, but it's not changing the color. So let's just change this to gray 200 and text black. let's try it with a gray with an A because that's a thing. Says it's disabled. Whoops. Oh, may have been reloading it. There it is. There's the problem. It was not even, it was disabled the whole time. And there's the other book we picked. So we have this working, but we're actually not getting the right object here, right? We're not getting the right properties because of that cover. Let's see how we're binding that cover before we break for the day or the week. Just a little notice. We're going to be doing this on Sundays for 2 hours for the next probably 3 or 4 weeks, and then we're going to move back to Wednesdays, same time, but we're going to keep it at the 2 hours. We're having some construction done, and so you couldn't hear me on Wednesdays, which is why we had to cancel it last time. And so let's look at that book component that we created. So the book component is expecting that cover ID to be there, which of course it's not. And that's the difference between these two results we're getting back. Probably missing a number of things like the authors and those sorts of things. And so let's go back here. Openlibrary.org. If we look at the way we're getting this, we can see there's a bunch of covers that we could use. What we'd really like to do is get the version that is with more details. So I really think that's the bigger trick here. And I don't think they're going to have a whole lot of... Yeah, and even in this case, they're not loading the authors. They're pointing out the authors as an extended object. And so there's a number of pieces here we're really going to want. And this works doesn't really give us enough. So let's go back to Open Library and see if we can figure this out. API. Because what we're doing is getting the search. We're using search to get this format, right? Let me make sure that's right. I don't want to make any assumptions. Subjects. We're using subjects to get at it, not search. Subjects. And so each of these works in here are really what we'd like to be able to get at the same sort of objects. And I think we say details equals true as well. So do we? No. And so what we'd really like to do is get the same format or something similar for books. So we have works, editions, and books. So the books one is the one that feels like we should be able to use. Book API. Of course that doesn't work. But let's grab that ID. So it's not finding the book. Why is it not? What is the OLID that we're missing here? Links created, less modified. This doesn't even have its, oh there, it's key. just getting back a raw format. Make sure that the format actually works. Let's do ISBN. Just to make sure that's not our problem. That is not our problem. You like the flashing screen? List of IDs for the information. This is not better. Source records, types. It's going to take some investigation. What I think I'll do, let's try something else. I'll do some research on these types because this is the really annoying part, right? That we're trying to get the format in a format that we've seen earlier. So it may be that we get both of them in the same format. So the works pages. Turn that representation. There's the ISBN. The request format, still not giving us a whole hell of a lot here. There's our subjects, title, key. At least we have the author name. What about covers? Very interesting. Well, I'm going to do the research before next week on this to see if we can find the right format. I won't do any code changes. I'm just going to do some investigation and see if we can't find a better way to do this. You know, the subjects are a good way to look for the items, but it may be that I replace it all with search or something that's going to return those same sorts of objects. But this has more to do with the API definition than anything else. Let's go back to our code. Actually, go back to this code, and let's see what all we have in here for changes. So here's the bookcase source, and we're getting a lot of pieces here that I don't really need. Okay, so let's come back to our root here and let's open up that get ignore, which I think is just one level too high. So I'm going to do some things. Let's go ahead and open a file. How was that helpful? Open a file. to our root. I'm going to get rid of this get ignore. Let's go ahead and open up that root one again. Here I'm going to need to add all the Visual Studio stuff. So vs get. Oops, let's do it in the other one. Vs get ignore. Just going to add all the Visual Studio specific stuff so that our changes should become much, much less. Yeah, all we're doing is the properties in the source code this time, moving that get ignore, and we should be able to go ahead and say added API. API project, and I'll go ahead and check that in, push it out to the GitHub repository. Thank you. Isn't that the same place? Yeah, it's the GitHub ignores are really pretty cool. And so I think that's going to wrap it up for now. We're right at 3 o'clock, and I'll try to be on time next time. Remember to subscribe if you want to know about when I'm going to be on here later. I'm also on Twitter. Let me actually switch this back over to side by side. Wow, my hair's been like that for hours, hasn't it? Ooh. No one noticed that, right? I can cut that out in post. I can't actually, but thanks everyone for coming. I hope the sound was better this time, and hopefully you got a little out of what I was building. Next time we'll dig more into the API and probably move the project over into a single Visual Studio project, even though we'll probably edit them separately like we've been doing. Have a great day, and again, I'm Sean Wildermuth on Twitter, Sean Wildermuth on TikTok, Sean Wildermuth here on Twitch, and S. Wildermuth, because for some reason Sean Wildermuth wasn't available, on YouTube, where you can also view these if you want to view them in the background. Thanks.